Welcome back to the Not Your Typical Bestsellers podcast. My name is Seraphine.
I'm Chloe.
I'm Meg.
And today we're going to be talking about Casey McQuiston's The One Last Stop book. So the blurb of the book is, One Last Stop is a delightful, speculative tale that follows August Latry, a somewhat cynical mystery lover who finds the ultimate puzzle in Jane, a punk rock lesbian she keeps encountering on the subway. August was raised by her single mom, who is obsessed with the disappearance of her brother August's uncle. And that was by bookpage.com.
So some information that might be important is that August's uncle is also named August, so her mom named August after her uncle.
Oh.
And this is also very important, is that Jane is like really hot, so you guys just need to keep that in mind.
Important character details.
Exactly.
Alright, so Casey McQuiston grew up in Louisiana, which is a place where they talk about in the book, right? Louisiana? Where is
Yeah,
it
they talk about
The
New
New Orleans. That's Louisiana.
That's in Louisiana, right?
Yeah, it is.
We know geography. Anyway, so Casey McQuiston grew up in Louisiana, which is a slightly important place for a couple members of the book. And she also waited tables, like, in her, 20s. And so actually a lot of the details, like, small details of this book are, like, parts of her personal life as well. And she mentions, like, talking about, in one of her interviews, she was talking about how younger her would have never... younger like Casey would have never thought that she could write like so personally, because it was like so close to her own life in some ways, not like the experience itself, obviously, because of the supernatural elements, spoiler, but like things like waiting tables, and like they live in New York now, all things like that. So Casey is non-binary, bisexual, and queer, but uses any pronouns, so we're going to be using like as many as we can throughout the podcast. And so that's, like, part of that, like, queer experience is why she can write so well about all these different queer characters from, like, different backstories and different parts, because, you know, she's interacted with the community in New York as well so much, and just, like, growing up over her life. She also can write so well about, like, grief in terms of loss, not necessarily in terms of death, right? How I remember in the last few, again, this is a spoiler, in the last few chapters of the book, where we're not sure where Jane is, if she's gone back to the 70s, or if she's, like, just around, and then August kind of goes through that grief of like losing Jane, because she's someone who was so important to her in the past year-ish, or like a little bit less than a year. And so she can talk so much about that, because it's something that she's dealt with a lot. She lost her dad in 2014 and like struggled with her mental health and went to therapy for grief and all of that, so it's something that she can talk very personally about. But yeah, I think a lot of the small details of the book are things that she's experienced. So like from her waiting tables, like she was able to come up with a Sue special from that, like the like special menu items of that had like that small restaurants, what do you call them, diners, often have. Like the Sue special wasn't invented where she worked, but she was able to come up with it because of that. Same thing like growing up in Louisiana, and now she lives in New York, and like her queer experience and all of that. What else should I say? I don't think there's anything I want to add now.
But okay, so Seraphine's going to be adding some more details about the author as we go, but those are some important things to keep in mind, so that you know everything that we talk about and that she's put in the book is very authentic. Yeah. So yeah, now Chloe is going to talk about something.
Okay, so I'll be talking about one of the themes we see. Well, actually, two of the main overlapping themes that I think kind of like go hand in hand that I see in the book, that unite all the characters, is finding yourself, and also trying to find a quote-unquote home, whether that be like a place, for example New York, or people, because home can be people. Mm-hmm. August really struggles with both August really struggles with both of those things. As we can see at the beginning, she's like constantly changing colleges and changing her majors. She dropped out, I don't remember how many, but she kept dropping out of colleges and transferring and stuff. And she can't decide on a major, and she's just like anxiety ridden about it, especially in the beginning, because she has no idea who she is. And like a lot of this anxiety has led to a lot of self-destructive behaviors, such as dropping out. And I think she does this on purpose, whether that's conscious or subconscious, because she's terrified of trying to find out what to do after college, which I feel like a lot of us can relate to, a lot of teenagers, because I don't think most of us know what we want to do, especially the fear of like trying to find yourself and like find your own life after college. And I feel like this relates to her personal life and her childhood, because as she was growing up, she was constantly moving. It was just her and her mom, so she never really had her people, and she never really had a place she could call home. And I feel like that relates to a lot of us as international students. We're constantly moving, like Seraphy and I. We're constantly moving, and so we don't really have a place we can call, like, quote-unquote home, which I really liked how the author, I'm going to butcher their name, but how they made it really relatable. So she kept moving cities because no place felt right, and she didn't know what she wanted. She moved around so much, and she never really could find a place called home. There's this one quote, I didn't note down any of the page numbers, so sorry about that. But the quote is, "Truth is, when you spend your whole life alone, it's incredibly appealing to move somewhere big enough to get lost in, where being alone looks like a choice," which is how she ended up in New York. And the theme of trying to find home is seen throughout the story. All the characters kind of share this. They're kind of like bonded as like misfits almost, as cheesy as that sounds. And as the book progresses, she becomes to feel more in place in New York, both because she just generally becomes more familiar. She has her like places, like the diner. She knows her subway route. So sorry. Good. All those stereotypical like New Yorker things, and she feels like a New Yorker. But then she also begins to feel more at place because she finds her people. She quote unquote like found family. She finally feels like she belongs where she is because she has people who she cares about and who cares about her. And this is something I feel like resonates with a lot of queer people. The characters are brought together because they're looking for somewhere to belong, and they sort of save each other. And there's another quote that kind of talks about this. Jane says, "I didn't save you, you're saving yourself." And August says, "I figured out you can't do that on your own." And this was a really like revealing thing for her, because she's depended on herself her whole life. She never really had her people. So this is her like finally opening up and being able to depend on other people, because she finally has her family, even though that's not blood related. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay, cool. She learns to open up and start depending on people. I really love this book because I feel like it talks a lot about things that we can all relate to. Not really knowing, as teenagers, we don't really know what we want to do, where we want to go. Like, some of us have our like, I want to be an engineer, I want to be this, I want to be that, but we still don't really know, like, we don't have our life planned out. And I thought this book like talked about it really well. Like the life of like a late teen, early 20s. A lot of the times it's really like romanticized in books and films. Like, you immediately like go to the big city and you immediately like fit in perfectly, whereas it's not really true, you know. So there's one last quote that I forgot to include, but I thought it was important because August kind of finds herself by like finding her environment first. Like, she found her people, she found where she belonged, and that helped her find herself. And the quote was said by Jane, and she said, "I dated this girl who was an artist, right? And she do a figure drawing." Sorry. So the quote was said by Jane, and she said, "Okay, I dated this girl who was an artist, right? And she'd do a figure drawing, where she'd draw the negative space around a person first, and then fill in the person." So I think that relates to how August finds herself, and how, like, I think people in general find themselves. They kind of pick the pieces, put the pieces together of, like, their environment first, and, like, maybe they're outside, like, they kind of find their style, find their hobbies, and that, like, relates to them being able to find who they are in their own personality, which I thought was really cool. I like the way that the author uses analogies like this.
Okay, so I really like everything that you said. I feel like it was very relevant, and I like the way that she uses characters that are in their like early-ish and mid-20s a lot. It makes it seem really cool, because a lot of the time when people talk about finding yourself, they think of it as you being a teenager who's finding themselves, whereas the author, they kind of put these people who you would have thought already figured themselves out because they've already been through college or whatever it is they're doing. But she's like, no, look, these feelings are universal, and it's really cool. And speaking of that, when you were talking about how August kind of drops out of all these colleges and everything, there's the same thing where Jane talks about, like, a lot of the characters are runaways, like Jane and Wes. And Jane says this quote where she's like, "But I only stayed long enough to take the good, and I always left when the bad got bad." I thought that was really, really cool and really universal, because a lot of the time, all these characters are kind of itching to run. Whenever anything goes wrong, that's what August does. She just kind of drops her place in college and runs somewhere else. So, yeah, I thought it was universal among the characters and something that kind of united them, like you were talking about.
And it's kind of like part of growing up is realizing that you can't always run from the bad stuff and like maturing.
Yeah.
And having to actually like go through and deal with those problems in your everyday life, because like in the end it'll work out, right? But like if you keep running away from the bad stuff, like you're never gonna find like your chosen family. Like you said, are you ready, or can I speak about it?
You can go ahead.
So the author, Casey, they actually talk a lot about chosen family, just because like writing a queer book, there's a couple things like that are really like essential to the queer experience. One thing that I thought was funny, she said that like yearning in a relationship is really important for the queer experience, so she always includes that stuff. Like if you've read Red, White, and Blue, Royal Blue, they're like yearning across the ocean, and in this one it's like she's stuck on the subway. So it's always like part of the story. But
and also speaking of that, there's this quote that Mila says, we were
Yeah,
joking about it before.
There was like the build up going on.
Yeah, she's like the build up of a queer relationship. Like you'll write each other love letters until you die, and you'll never know whether you're like joking or like actually horny for each other.
Yeah, I like how they talked about that, because, and I feel like a lot of like queer books that aren't written by queer people, that just like queer shows that are written by straight people, for example, they just say like queer people get into a relationship and they're immediately perfect together, but like this book really talked about like trying to figure out like differentiate the feelings of platonic to romantic feelings. I thought it was really humorous.
Essential part of a queer existence. So, and the author says that another like integral part of the queer existence basically is finding your found family, and how a lot of people thought that the like quote wish fulfillment part of the book was actually like the fantastical romance and the like happy ever after, but for Casey it was more about finding your like queer ecosystem. So like you have like, so how August had Jane and Mila and Nico and Wes and
Isaiah,
and Isaiah and like her whole like all these like queer people around her, right, her family. And that was for Casey more of the wish fulfillment than it was the like happy ever after, especially coming from like a not really forgiving upbringing like in Louisiana, and a couple of the characters in the book have this as well. They don't come really from like a friendly place, and so like finding that queer family is your wish fulfillment, if that makes sense. And then the author also talks about how there are a lot of readers who feel isolated and haven't found their place yet, and that she hopes that this book will be a little bit of wish fulfillment for them.
That's so cute. I love that.
It is really cute. This one is kind of sad to talk about, but I feel like it was very relevant, and I really enjoyed the way the author, Casey McQuiston, wrote about this. So, reading this book, I realized how much has changed since the 1970s, and yet everything is still the same. This is why I was really distraught to hear Jane say, "Sometimes I wonder if I fell out of time because I never really belonged where I started, and the universe is trying to tell me something." Because there are moments where existing is still an act of defiance this very day for people like Jane and Nico and my very much beloved Isaiah / antidepressant. He was such a they were such a cool character. There are days when, just like Jane has described of the 70s, sometimes someone hates a part of who you are. There were people in the punk scene and the anti-war crowd who hated gays, and people in the lesbian crowd who hated Asians. Everywhere she went, this is a quote from the book, everywhere she went, someone loved her, but everywhere she went, someone hated her. This hasn't changed. People are always looking to put you in a box, and when there's a part of you that doesn't fit and that you refuse to conform to, they begin to hate you. Then or now, it doesn't make a difference. Maybe people try to stay quiet about it, but then again, sometimes they don't. And Jane is a fighter. Quote unquote, she cooked people dinner. She took them to the hospital. She stitched them up. And so sometimes as I read, I thought maybe it would be better for Jane to go back to the 70s. Maybe there she can continue to fight and do something active to not feel so useless about the whole situation. And then other times, I thought much the same as August, transposing Jane to the here and now and thinking, she will be the nightmare that awakens you. This is a quote from Marie Shelley that was said in the book by Jane. Your friendly smile of acceptance from the safe position of your heterosexuality isn't enough. As long as you cherish the secret belief that you are a little bit better because you sleep with the opposite sex, you are still asleep in your cradle, and we will be the nightmare that awakens you. And you know what? The family Casey McQuiston writes about, the kind of world I really hope is out there, is the nightmare or a dream, depending from where you're standing, that awakens you. There's the scene in Delilah's where, and this is a quote, August remembers Jane telling her about drag shows she used to go to in the 70s. The balls, how queens would go hungry for weeks to buy gowns, the shimmering nightclubs that sometimes felt like the only safe places. She lets Jane's memories transpose over here, now. Like a double-exposed film. 2 generations of messy, loud, brave, and scared, and brave again people stomping their feet and waving their hands with bitten nails, all the things they share and all the things they don't, the things that people like Jane smashed windows and spat blood for. And I think about how far we've come, how privileged we are to get to experience life like this. But why should we have to think of that feeling of safety as such a privilege? To be who we are, as we are, happily, contentedly, when this is never a question for the cishets. And more than that, Jane's story is not singular. She says, I don't even think I fully knew I was gay yet. I was just different, and my dad and I would fight. And my mom would cry. This part was really relatable for, like, I think everybody. And I would feel like shit. Guys, you don't have to call me out, okay?
You called yourself out, man.
I called everyone out. You just singled me out. Okay.
It's okay.
Fine. And I would feel like shit all the time. I thought running away would be better than letting them down. And I felt like it was so sad how universal that experience is. Not even just when I was thinking about it, but also in the book. It was the same for Augie and for Wes and for Suzette, who is August's mom. All of them spanning generations from before the 70s to, like, the here and now. And so, yeah, that was kind of what I was thinking when I was reading, how everything is the same, but everything is different. And so, yeah, what are you guys' thoughts?
I like what you said about how, what was that part about running away? Like, how that's, how we all, like, kind of can relate to that, running away from things, or, like, what you said also about not knowing, like, what we're looking forward to. Something, I was talking about how the author wouldn't be able to write this book if they weren't, like, who they are now, if that makes sense. Because, like the author, Casey, she mentioned in an interview that they came to see things like birthdays as an opportunity for transformation and not something to dread. So that kind of ties into, like, what you were saying about, like, not running away from things, but instead, like, seeing them, like, how August saw Jane, instead of, like, running away, saw her as, like, something that she could bring into her life and, like, take with her, make part of her chosen family. You know, that was one thought I had. Chloe, anything?
It's not perfectly related, but I also wanted to mention, I really liked how Casey had a lot of, like, talked about HIV and AIDS in the 70s, and I really like that, like, representation, because I don't think it's talked about enough at all, and, like, she talked about it in a really, like, honest light, and how much it, like, hurt the community. And she talked about it through Jane's, like, eyes, and how she was, like, friends with a lot of gay men at the time who, like, suffered from it. And I thought that was a really important thing to mention, even though we don't have enough time to talk about it now.
Yeah, and spoiler alert here, but towards the end of the book, when she was talking about how August and Jane are, like, were interconnected before they ever found each other, with August as in Uncle August, and how there was, like, that fire at a gay club, and it was, like, purposeful arson, and I feel like things like that, I don't know if that's an actual fact and something that really happened, but it's something that probably based on something that's a fact. And so there's these kind of crossovers between, like, what I was talking about in the 70s, how things were so aggressive, but there was something to fight for. And now sometimes it's more microaggression, or even things like we still don't have, like, our full rights in a lot of countries and places around the world, but it's not something that's being actively fought anymore. So
yeah, I think, like, reading about things like this, about the history of, like, queer people, should make us queers in the present feel really appreciative, especially those of us that aren't like surrounded by people who hate, like, everything about us, you know, who aren't gonna, like, murder us, because, you know, there's a difference between maybe not accepting you fully and, like, treating you a little differently and, you know, wanting to kill you. I think it's good for us to read about these things and be grateful for the people who made it possible for us to not live in fear of being murdered every day, you know. And the author was actually talking about this in another interview. I heard so many interviews, but how, like, having to research about this queer history instead of learning about it in schools, although yes, of course we should learn about it in schools, but it made it really meaningful for them to have to research about this, because it made it like, oh, like, this is part of my theory. It made it really, like, important, and they were able to, like, deep dive into it. So I think that's also, like, really important that we do take like books like these to like spark our interest and like go research and read about those things, like Stonewall and like all that stuff. The author also mentioned the like having Jane come from the 70s was like perfect because it was like post Stonewall, like just post Stonewall, those riots, and like the queer like community was starting to come out more and starting to be more like do all these protests, and like also the intersectionality, the Asian American part. There was also a lot of Asian American like revolution at the time of like them wanting to be known, right, for like who they are. So I thought that was like good.
She mentions a lot of really cool things, like how Jane dug through an issue of Workwin's newspaper, which is like pages in Chinese and like English, and I thought that was really cool. She also mentions a lot of like 70s propaganda, like Marxist things, and like post-war marches and things like that, which was really cool. And like Seraphine was mentioning, while I do understand, and I was definitely really excited to be able to sticky note pages where it was like queer history, but I think it's also really cool to let some places in the world do teach that to you. And so it, like, obviously I'd still be excited to research it, but it's not like, oh my gosh, here's a piece of queer history, let me just like, you know.
I'm glad. So I think we should start coming to the end of our podcast, so we're going to go around each do some final thoughts, like favorite parts of the book, and we're going to rate it out of 5.
What is your big takeaway from the book?
Okay, so with 2 things. Firstly, I really want to say that this is definitely one of my favorite, well, I mean, she only has 2, but this will be one of my forever favorites, because Casey McQuiston is a really special author to me. And when I read Red, White, and Royal Blue, and I read Alex going through his bisexual crisis, I too went through a bisexual crisis. And so they are a very important author to me. And this is one of the first, there was Ruby Fruit Jungle, but this is the second like sapphic book I've ever read, so it's also really important. Nice. And guys,
you should read more sapphic books.
I will read more sapphic books,
not just fan fiction.
Don't out her like that.
Sorry, I'm getting called out so much.
I really am. You guys are so mean. Okay, but my biggest takeaway from this book is this quote where Mila is talking to August, and she said, "Sometimes the point is to be sad, August. Sometimes you just have to feel it because it deserves to be felt." And I feel like there was a lot of that throughout the book, feeling things because they deserve to be felt. So that is my biggest takeaway. And obviously, because it's Casey McQuiston, and she, they, he, him is an amazing author. Guys, I'm just trying to get through all the pronouns, so you guys, nobody calls me out. You said she uses all pronouns. Anyway, because this is one of their books, I have to give it a 5 out of 5.
Nice, thanks. Yes.
So my takeaway, I really liked how honest Casey made August. I also struggle with like being too independent and not being able to depend on people, and I also have no idea what I want to do in the future. So I felt that her character was really vulnerable and relatable. I don't know if that's a takeaway, but I also really enjoyed the found family stuff. Like, your family doesn't have to be blood related. It can be people you find, and home doesn't have to be like an actual place. It can be your people. I really like the queers that found each other. Yeah. Rating 5 out of 5. This is my first Casey McQuiston book.
You said it.
Did I say it right? Okay. And I know it's a queer tragedy that I haven't read their first book, Red, White, and Royal Blue, but I will, I promise, eventually.
Good job.
And sorry, I don't want to interrupt Seraphine, but I also just wanted to say really quick about August. I was really excited when she was kind of like a chubbier character, because I feel like you don't get that a lot. And there's this one quote, don't have it memorized verbatim, but spoiler alert, so she goes onto the queue at like for her first date with Jane, and she's wearing like these thigh-high socks, and she's talking about how like they dig into her thighs. And I was just thinking about it, because every time I wear something I always think about that, but then she thought about it, but then she let it go, and it was very important to me to read that.
When Jane was like, you just go around looking that beautiful.
Yes.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Empowering.
Yeah.
It made me feel so happy to hear
so
that.
Cute. They were so cute.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay, so can you?
But I think my favorite part was how they brought in the queer history, because kind of a history nerd, and I think it's like super important for us to know, like, while we're still going through like queer revolution, and especially with like gender identity nowadays, a large part of that, like the violent part that needed to happen has already happened, as in the US. In other countries, not as much as like US centric book. So I think that's really important that the character of Jane was able to bring that 70s into the present, because like this is a kind of book that I think, like, you know, it's not YA, the author said it's not YA, but it is like an adult book, and that a lot of like young people like us would pick up. But then we but then it has that kind of like surprise, like talking
Yeah.
about the history of it, which I think is super important. So I'm glad that they brought that into the book and were able to teach young gays
Yeah.
about their history.
I agree. I really love the queer history representation because we don't
Yes.
like queers just don't know enough about it, which
Yeah.
is a shame.
Mhm.
Yeah, rating.
I really liked the subjects that the book talked about, but it wasn't my favorite book I've ever read. So I think I would rate it like a good 3.75 to 4 out of 5.
Wow, harsh.
Very specific.
Hard. Okay, 4
No,
out of 5.
no, no. We're
No, it's okay.
We support. We support.
Yeah.
Seraphina, what could she have done better?
Yeah,
No, I just no.
you have to give a reason for the 4 out of 5.
I did. I think some of the things were like cliche, but that's it.
Yeah,
but I'm also just a very like I've read too many YA books.
Yeah. At the beginning,
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm
So
tired of this. This
yeah.
main character's a pick me girl, but
Yeah,
I got over it.
Sometimes. So like
Yeah.
everything is cliche, but it was also like super cute, and I
Yeah.
liked the character and I liked the story. So.
I mean, it is a rom-com, so you know sometimes
Exactly.
the genre just isn't
I think
for
I'm
you.
just exactly. I think that's part of it. But anyway,
Yeah.
so yes, 4 out of 5.
I think I'm just easily impressed, so I give all books 5 out of 5.
Yeah. I usually do
little
too. I was
bit.
trying to think critically.
For me, I think I'm just a little bit in love with Casey.
I think you
McQuiston,
are. That's
valid,
so
that's
I
valid.
just have to give it a 5.
Thank you for listening.
And
Check out One Last Stop if you haven't already.
And read Red, White, and Royal Blue, so you're not a queer disaster like Chloe.
Wow.
For reasons that are because you didn't read the book. You can fix that.
Bye.
Bye. Love you guys.